So in this lecture, we're going to start by discussing why it is that the study of Rome still matters in a contemporary environment in the 21st century. And this is an interesting starting point because 50 years ago, there really wasn't any need for such a discussion. It was taken as a given in places around Western Europe and in the United States that educated people were supposed to know about Rome. And for hundreds of years, this had been true. And this had been true among our founding fathers. This had been true among French intellectuals in the 18th century. This had been true among monks and leaders of the Catholic Church. This had been true among Byzantine scholars and politicians. This had been true for a very, very long time. And even into the middle of the 20th century, most major US universities actually required students to have a background in Latin and by extension a familiarity with Roman history before they were even admitted. And so Roman history had occupied this position without much question or debate for a very long time. And this is actually a significant problem because when something is seen as an integral part of a cultural legacy, very little effort is actually made to justify why that's the case. When something is taken as a given, there's very little discussion of why it might be necessary to still incorporate the study of something like ancient Rome into a modern environment. And we can understand perhaps why this would be taken as a given in places like Western Europe, countries like France or Italy, Germany or England or Spain, where those countries had been under Roman control and had been under Roman control for a very long time and were integral parts of the empire. And so in some ways, that's the history of those regions. In the United States is a little bit different, but the founding fathers created our Constitution based upon their idea of what the Roman Republic was. And so for us in the United States, Roman history represents a basic part of how our system of government is designed. And it often also offers a basic background for how Americans are taught to understand the political dynamics in their country and the dynamics of their own political system. And this is also important because it not only speaks to why our political system works well, but it also speaks to some of the problems our political system might have. But in the course of the 20th century, curricula and scholars and universities began to think a little more critically about why we study what we study and why the study of things like Rome might need to be supplemented or replaced. And so universities in the 20th century added new departments. They dropped the Latin requirement. They dropped the expectation that people would come to university knowing Roman history. They broadened their teaching interests, and they began to question how ancient history and the ancient world fits into discussions of the modern world. And of course, our politics changed as well. And so the concepts of political freedom and representative government that were pretty integral into how the people in the United States understood their position in the world and understood their position as citizens of our political system, those concepts became much more abstract. Concepts of freedom and representative government became things that were not directly grounded on a Roman experience, but instead became kind of open to interpretation. And Roman models of political liberty also began to matter much less because liberty shifted from being a concept that people struggled with and engaged with and thought critically about. And it evolved into something a little more akin to a kind of bumper sticker, a label that people like to trot around and advocate for, but don't think very critically about what liberty means and how liberty should play out in an environment. And Romans, for all of their flaws, were people who thought very critically and at a great deal of length and for a very long time about what liberty meant. And so the relevance of the Roman world in a new academic and political environment now needs to be explained because it's first of all not taken for granted, and second of all, our politics and our conceptions of what those political developments and political lives are like have evolved significantly since our country began with this firm grounding in the understanding of the Roman past. And there have been reactions to this from all sides of the political spectrum. And so we do see quite frequently scholars bemoaning in the loudest possible terms the political motivations of people who have turned away from the study of the ancient world. And so depending on who those people are, someone who has turned away from the Roman world might be a communist or a fascist. They might be politically correct, or they might be anti-intellectual conservative. There are lots of labels that are thrown around, and most of the time those things are thrown around unfairly. Because whatever the motives that people have for studying something other than Roman history, those motives generally are pure. And when you attack those people for not wanting to study Rome, that's at best unhelpful. And at worst, it's actually somewhat damaging and dangerous, not only to those people themselves, but to the pursuit and the study of Roman history. People can and should have a range of intellectual interests. And those things are things that people can pursue without their basic integrity being questioned. And so Roman history can still be studied, but Roman history is something that should also be studied with a view towards larger questions and bigger perspectives. And Roman history is enhanced and expanded by including different perspectives, different backgrounds, and different questions than have been approached in the past by people who study Roman history. Now, the moment that we can say that Roman history matters because Roman history matters has certainly passed. But Roman history still does matter. And again, if we think of the political dynamics of the past few years in the United States and around the world, it's clear that Roman history does matter. It matters significantly for helping us to understand things like what goes on in a republic, what goes on in a free political system. But Roman history actually means a lot more than just providing tools to help us understand our political system. Because the Roman legacy actually deeply impacts much of the world around us. And so if we think about this, there are lots and lots of aspects of modern life in Western Europe and in the United States that grow out of things that happened and techniques that developed and aesthetics that emerged in the Roman world. In literature, satire is something that is deeply, deeply influential in the Roman world and something that directly influences our life now. The novel is something that emerges in the Mediterranean at the time when Rome is expanding. Rhetoric is something that becomes systematized and available in a large-scale educational curriculum in the Roman period. When we think about religion, of course, Christianity is a religion that develops in the Roman Empire. Jesus lived under the Emperor Augustus. Christianity, as it emerges out of Judea and into the Mediterranean world more broadly, it is emerging into a Roman Mediterranean world. But it's not just Christianity. Rabbinic Judaism also is a product of a set of developments in the Roman world. The legal legacy of the Romans is immense. Roman law codes are the basis for law in as diverse places as Japan and Louisiana. But one of the things that, of course, stands out most prominently is the influence that Roman architecture has on our world. So, for example, this is the Pantheon in Rome, a temple that behind it, of course, has a large central dome. And this is the Jefferson Memorial, a visual quotation of the Pantheon. This is a famous portrait of Napoleon by Jean-Auguste Dominique Onguerre. And of course, it's modeled on a portrait, a lot of Roman portraits, but this portrait of the Emperor Tiberius gives you a sense of this. The Roman legacy is not just in architecture and high art, however. The idea of Rome is something that means something to us and our culture in a way that impacts also our popular culture. So, of course, we have Hollywood. Hollywood loves Rome. Spartacus, Gladiator, and lots of other things in between. The whole sandal and sword movie. This is a great Hollywood thing. But one of my favorite examples of this comes from the now nearly forgotten 1980s synth pop band Animotion. And their video for the song Obsession from 1985 shows them dancing around a pool in the Hollywood Hills dressed in plastic Roman armor. Now, none of this in Animotion's video makes any sense whatsoever. And none of these images that you see in things like the Animotion video pretend to capture anything true about the Roman world. There's so much that's anachronistic and bizarre about this video that it doesn't show anything other than the fact that Rome remains a vital part of our popular culture. But as these examples show, Rome continues to have a great deal of appeal to people, even those people who never thought about Roman history in any real way. And so while pop music and film can evoke the image of Rome without really claiming to represent it with any kind of historical accuracy, it's more important when we think about the use of Rome by academics and journalists, by politicians and public intellectuals, if only because we tend to think about their ideas more, and their ideas tend to be much more consequential than, say, the singers of Animotion. Um, and these ideas that are influential in our modern world work off of the basic idea that there are some similarities between current realities and those in the Roman world. And this is something that's become particularly prominent. This has gone on for a very long time, but it's become particularly prominent in the last couple decades. So if you look at most major news publications in the last few years, you'll see many journalists drawing comparisons between the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire and the United States. And I'm one of the people who does this, so I am someone who has to sort of plead guilty to this. And this has become quite common, and it's been going on for years. And some of these comparisons are nuanced, and they do offer perspectives on our world at this moment by using Rome as a tool. In other cases, though, they're pretty clumsy. So one thing that's particularly interesting, though, is the way that this has changed in recent years. So I've taught this course for 20 years. And I've seen this shift pretty dramatically in just those 20 years. So when I started teaching in the lead up to the Iraq War, one saw a lot of examples of people using the Roman Empire as a tool to help understand what would happen when the United States power expanded to the point where it was, in a sense, overreaching the limits, overreaching the resources and reaching the limits of what America could handle. And so right in the lead up to the Iraq War, one sees things like this quote from The Economist that says, envy is a worm that does not rest. It's the cause of the resentment and hatred shown to us. Thus a Spanish soldier wrote in the 1580s, but could just as well have been a Briton in the 19th century or a Roman in the second, and now it's America's turn. Another example that came in the New York Times at roughly the same time is speaking about Americans considering expanding the war on terror into Iraq. And Michael Ignatov writes, in essence, this is a characteristic delusion of imperial power, to confuse global power with global domination. And Americans may have the former, but they do not have the latter. Now, when I began teaching, my students were full of questions around these kinds of ideas of, does the fall or the decline of the Roman Empire provide some lessons that Americans can learn in a way that helps us understand the position of the United States in the world in the early 21st century. What's interesting, of course, is now those questions have changed. And they've changed in a pretty dramatic fashion, because the questions that I faced when I began teaching were about the Roman Empire, were about the Roman Empire as a global power that had perhaps overextended itself, and about the lessons that America may face in terms of its foreign policy objectives as one sees them through the perspective of the Roman Empire. But now that's changed. Now the discussion is actually quite different. The discussion is not actually about the United States as the Roman Empire. In the aftermath of the 2016 election, and especially in the aftermath of the assault on the Capitol in January of 2021, what we've seen are shifts to discussing the Roman Republic and understanding our world through the lens of the experiences of Romans living under their republic, and in particular, the last phases of the Roman Republic. And so this is just a passage by the scholar Daniel Allen, talking about Cicero and using Cicero to help understand some of the early phases of the presidency of Donald Trump. What's particularly interesting about this is that we're now 20 years after the fact, 20 years after the lead up to the Iraq War and the discussion of America as a superpower with a decline, a superpower decline framed in a Roman imperial context. And now, in a sense, Rome is being used not to understand our foreign policy, but to understand our domestic political dynamics. But this raises some important questions. When we're using a state and a people that lived thousands of years ago to try to understand the present, we need to be very, very careful. Because the use of Roman history can be useful in giving us tools to think about the present, but it is not an exact parallel for the present. The present is, of course, its own thing. And there are similarities between, say, the Roman Republic and the American Republic. That's actually quite deliberate. When our founders set out to design the American Republic, one of the things they were looking at was the Roman Republic. And so there are going to be aspects of our political architecture that draw upon these Roman examples. And there will be weaknesses in our republic that we can also see as weaknesses in the Roman Republic. But our republic is different. Our world is different. And so Rome is a very useful tool for us to think with. But Rome is not a historical paradigm that we must repeat. It's instead something that is a set of inexact parallels that can help us think about dynamics in our world. And so while there are some real similarities to the present, Rome is distinct. And while it may offer us some lessons for where certain modern paths may lead, those are lessons that should allow us to imagine possible outcomes. They are not prescriptions for what will actually come to pass. And so Rome can help us better understand the world around us, but Rome is not, in a sense, the key to unlock deeper mysteries about how our politics will work, or how our foreign policy will develop, or what will happen to our country in 20 or 50 or 200 years. So if the Roman world is not entirely like ours, what actually was the Roman world like? Well, this gives us a sense of how big the Roman Empire was in the year 200 AD. This is near to the greatest extent of the Roman Empire. To give you some comparisons, if you overlay the Roman Empire on the United States, this is what you get. Basically, I think if you can imagine the Roman Empire, what you would have to understand is it is actually from kind of its northwestern extreme to its southeastern extreme. It is farther than the corners of the continental United States are from each other. So the distance basically from London to Saudi Arabia, the southeastern corner of the Roman Empire at that time, is nearly the same distance as from New York to San Diego. And so when we're thinking about the size of this place, we should think about it as something that is basically the size of the United States. If the Roman Empire were a country now, it's a country that would probably be the fourth or fifth largest country in the world. It's a massive, massive place. But even more important than the geographic area that the Roman Empire encompasses is the amount of people it includes. At the end of the first century AD, roughly the point where this class is going to stop, the Roman Empire had total population of around 80 million people. To put that in perspective, the world population at that time was roughly 300 million people. So what that means is about 1 in 4 people in the world lived within the Roman Empire at that time, which would make its share of the world population equivalent in a modern term to the share of the world population now living in India and China combined. And so this is, relatively speaking, a huge place in geographic and human terms. But it's also a place that is incredibly diverse in terms of the territory that it controls. So this gives you a sense of what the southeast looks like. This is Hyrcania in Israel. This is not the frontier by any means. This is just part of the territory under the control of the Roman Empire in the east. And then if you go to the other side of the empire, you have something like this. Empty as well, but green, rainy, full of life, full of agriculture, and also, of course, hot and cold. You also have differences in the way that the terrain is laid out. So this is Cappadocia in Asia Minor, and that's, of course, Romania. Both were part of the Roman Empire. To give you a sense of some of the other things, this is the oasis city of Palmyra in Syria along the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. And this is Trier in Germany in the northwestern corner of the Roman Empire. And so again, you can see the incredible diversity in the types of environments that the Roman world occupied, but also, of course, there's tremendous similarity because this is an amphitheater in what's now northwestern Germany, and you have similar amphitheaters all around the Mediterranean, including in places like Israel and in Morocco, and even in places in the northeastern part of the Mediterranean. Um, What's also really important to understand is the diversity of regions in a modern context is represented by the fact that over 40 modern countries were all or partly contained in the space that is the Roman Empire. This is everything from Syria to Portugal and everything from Britain to Saudi Arabia. But even though these territories are very different from each other, they were all linked together by a remarkable system of Roman roads. And so this gives you a sense not just of all the Roman roads. These are not all of the Roman worlds. This Roman roads. This is, in a sense, actually kind of if you were to map the Roman interstate system, because that's what this is. These are the biggest roads in the Roman Empire. And you can see that they span this entire space of the Mediterranean, and they link these places together intimately. And the great benefit that Rome had is these roads were traversable, they were maintained, and they were available to any Roman citizen who needed to go wherever any Roman citizen needed to go. They were policed. Transport was relatively easy. It was relatively safe. And this is a very, very important thing because what it means is this empire is not just controlled from the center in a kind of arbitrary way. It's actually unified. There's actually lots of effort being made, not just to control these territories, but to bring them together and to facilitate commerce and to facilitate cultural interchange. And to facilitate the spread of ideas and the spread of religions and the spread of economic development. And for the better part of nearly 400 years, this system works. It works really, really well. But it's not just road networks. The Roman Empire also had very extensively developed sea transportation networks. So beginning in the mid part of the 1st century BC, when the Roman Navy clears the Mediterranean of pirates, the seas were open for navigation and trade in a way that they really had not been before and really would not be again until the modern age. And this meant that huge numbers of ships sailed back and forth across the Mediterranean. The sailing season in the Mediterranean ran roughly from March to October. And during that time, captains ran set routes to and from many of the most important seaports in the Mediterranean. And so if you had enough money, you could pay for a special trip, sort of like an ancient version of a private jet where the traveler would be able to go wherever he or she wanted simply by paying a ship captain a necessary fee. There was also regular commerce in which, if you didn't want to pay expressly to go from one place to another, you could go on a ship that was traveling more or less the slow way to where you needed to go. But the networks were so extensive that communication was facilitated, and this empire was capable of spreading news back and forth across this immense space. But that spread of news did not happen as fast as, say, it does now with the internet. News spread as fast as someone could carry it. And so what that meant was effectively news could be carried about 50 miles a day if it was moving by land. Now that's really, really impressive in a pre-modern context. It's something that most other ancient states couldn't ever imagine being able to do across this distance. But still, in a modern context, that's pretty slow. If you move by sea, it would be somewhat faster. But news going from Rome to Alexandria in Egypt, so Rome is in the center of your map, Roma, and then Alexandria is in the lower right corner, that took about 9 days during the sailing season. So it's not super fast, but it's not as slow as if you were to do this by land. But in the winter, when the ships are not sailing, you either had to risk getting caught in a storm and possibly having your ship sink, and that was a real risk, or you had to wait. And so this is not a society in which the central government can control things efficiently because the central government can't actually know what's going on fast enough to make a dramatic and immediate response. So if something happens in Alexandria that the emperor needs to know about in, say, the 1st century AD, the ship going to Rome would take 9 days. The emperor would then hear about this, make a decision. It would take another 9 days for the ship to go back to Alexandria and inform people of what the imperial decision was. In practice, what this means is in many parts of the Roman world, decision-making in an immediate sense and fast decision-making was delegated out to people in the region. And so the empire worked very well by balancing central control over resources with a rapid ability of people in regions to respond effectively to the problems around them. So if this is the context for what the Roman Empire and the Roman state was like at its peak, what was it like for regular people? What was it like for, say, a random person, one of those 80 million? Well, most people in the Roman world lived in the countryside. Most of them lived on farms, and the conditions in farms were relatively primitive, just a bit beyond subsistence living in many cases, and the work they did was physically quite demanding. Most of these people would, if they made it out of infancy, probably die somewhere between the age of 50 or 60, and the lifestyle was a very punishing one. It was very, very difficult. If you lived in a city, though, the situation was somewhat different. So cities in the Roman world occupy a really important niche for assembling resources and organizing those resources and directing them back out into the population and into the economy. And in many of the cities in the Roman world, people actually lived pretty densely in apartment buildings, things called insulae. So these are some insulae from the city of Ostia, just beyond the city of Rome, just sort of down the Tiber River from the city of Rome. And what you see in the insula in Ostia are ground floor shops, restaurants. There are places where you have like soup stands, and then above them are apartments. And these insulae could be as much as 6 or 7 stories tall. And so people would live densely packed on top of each other. For most of the people living in these insulae, the situation was, basically one of very crowded, very dense, very loud experiences, but also experiences where you bonded very well with your neighbors and the people around you, because this is urban living. And in an environment where in many of these apartments, people didn't even have kitchens. And so they would go down to the ground floor, they would get their food down there, they would eat down there, they would socialize in the thermopolia, in the soup kitchens, in the streets, and they would interact with each other. It was a very social sort of environment. So social, in fact, that there was even public latrines, centralized latrines like this. And this latrine, obviously you can see how this works, but what's interesting about this is there is a flow of water that runs underneath all of these places where people sit and defecate, and then the water kind of washes these things out through pipes and through a sewer system. It is, as one scholar said, Romans got about 90% of the idea of sanitation right, but they didn't know about germ theory. And so with these latrines, what you, of course, have are situations where people go and they go to the bathroom there, and the waste is actually carried away very efficiently. But what was not understood was the necessity of dealing with microorganisms, because Romans didn't know microorganisms existed. And so what modern scholars have been able to see is that these latrines actually do a wonderful job of removing waste quickly, but they do a terrible job of protecting people from parasites. And so in places where Roman public latrines and Roman sanitation really take hold, scholars have actually found an increase in the amount of things like tapeworms and whipworms in burial deposits and in other things that allow us to see the degree to which these parasitic infections are impacting people. And so in some ways what you see here, Romans do a very good job of creating high density urban environments that can remove waste very quickly. But they do a very poor job of dealing with problems that they didn't know existed, problems of microorganisms and micro-hygiene as opposed to the macro-hygiene, which was moving waste products away. If you were rich enough, though, you could have a private latrine. And so this is a private latrine from the city of Ostia. It's actually underneath a stairway. And this one is better than most because most private latrines actually abut the kitchen. This again reflects the idea that this is a way to get water out quickly. Usually there's sort of plumbing that washes these things out from the house. But of course, if you don't know about microorganisms, what you also don't know is that sometimes having waste that close to the kitchen can lead to things like parasitic infections getting into your food or getting into the water you're cooking with. Romans also would spread waste from latrines on fields as fertilizer. It's in some ways a very progressive way of thinking about reusing waste products, but it also is a very poor way of ensuring that parasites don't get into the system of people eating these foods. And so what we have to understand about the Romans is they did very, very well in dealing with and creating structures to deal with the problems that they actually faced. And these structures are things that Romans create, these sanitation structures, bathhouses, public latrines. They're created and they're very prominent in Italy, but they also exist across the Mediterranean. Rome, when it invented this kind of technology, was very liberal about allowing other aspects and other parts of the empire to use this technology as well. Now, the last idea that we have to leave with before we get out of a broad survey of Rome and why it matters is the idea of time and the idea of historical time. And this is an important thing to remember because it's very, very easy for people in a modern context to imagine Roman history flipping by quickly. And when we look at the Roman world in a history book, it's completely possible to turn 5 pages and have moved 300 years. But 300 years is a very, very long time. That's 12 generations of people. It's longer than the written record of events in California. And sometimes when we deal with something as vast and enduring as the Roman Empire, we forget how many individual lives and experiences are wrapped up in that history. So when things finally start to go wrong with the Roman world at the end of the 4th century AD, there are people who lived in houses in many cities across the Mediterranean that are 700 years old. And they're part of families that have not seen their property touched by war in 10 or 12 or 15 generations. And so beneath the history of Rome's rise and Rome's fall are hundreds of millions of personal stories. Stories about the people who lived in this world when they were born, when they grew up, when they married, and when they died. And all of these stories unfolded in the stable world that the Roman state produced. And the stable world that the Roman state maintained for much of the first 4 centuries AD. Now, in this course, we're not going to get into many of these stories. We have to move too fast. But as we move through Roman history, it's important to remember that for each of the events we discuss, there are going to be people living and experiencing these things. And there are also going to be people living and experiencing a whole lot of other things that never make it into the historical record at all. In some of these cases, the dramatic events that show up in this class will be the one moment in somebody's life where something comes to become important enough that it rises to our attention. Their entire life will unfold in a structure or in an environment where, in a sense, nothing of grand historical significance happened. But a lot happened to them. A lot happened to those individuals. And for those individuals, Roman history is neither abstract nor is it fast-moving, because Rome happened in real time. Rome's rise happened in real time. Rome's achievement in acquiring an empire happened in real time. Rome's decline and eventually its collapse happened in real time. But for much of that time, Rome is just there in the background while people live their lives. And the people living their lives don't know how the story of Rome ends. They don't have the benefit of understanding, like we do, what events that they might have seen might have consequences 50 or 100 years down the line. But there's also an important aspect that comes out of that we have to keep in mind. Rome's victories are never preordained. Rome's success in overcoming challenges is never predetermined. And the people fighting for these things, and the people making sure that Rome had a positive outcome when it faced a crisis, these people don't know that they're destined to achieve and be successful in overcoming that crisis. These crises unfold without people having the assurance that we do, knowing that Rome will prevail, or Rome will survive, or Rome will recover. These people are dealing with these crises with all of the emotion and all of the stress that comes along with living through a moment of crisis for yourself. And so ultimately, what this lecture has done is given a series of snapshots. The rest of these lectures are going to be used to fill out a better picture that moves chronologically, moves thematically, and gives us a sense of how we go from the beginning of Rome to that moment in the first century that we saw when Rome controls most of the territory around the Mediterranean and a quarter of the entire population of the world.